One major point of debate among Arminians and Calvinists is the doctrine of election. Classical Arminians believe that God's election is conditioned on his foreknowledge of faith. Calvinists respond by insisting that divine election for salvation is unconditional. My name is Dr. Matt O'Reilly of orthodoxyforeveryone.com, and in this video I'll explain why the Calvinist view fails to give a satisfactory account of the biblical evidence for the doctrine of election. We'll also talk about how we need to be thinking about mission when we're talking about election in biblical perspective. If you like this content, if you find it helpful, help me out by liking, subscribing, and sharing it with your friends. Now, from the Calvinist perspective, God's choice with regard to who will be saved is made without reference to that person's faith or anything else they do. And those who are not chosen are passed over. They remain in their condemned state with no hope of salvation. The technical term in theology for this very unfortunate group is reprobate. If we want to understand what the Bible teaches about election, we need to understand what it says about the reprobate, about those who are passed over, the unchosen, the unelect. Now, to do that, we've got to go all the way back to the figure of Abraham. The initial account of God's choice of Abraham and his family comes in the opening verses of Genesis 12. That's where we discover that God picked Abraham and promised to bless him by giving him first a large family and second the land of the Canaanites. The first observation to be made is that when God chose Abraham's family to be his people, everyone else was passed over. Choosing one always means rejecting others. God picked Abraham's family. He did not pick the Canaanites. Abraham's family was the elect nation. Other nations were reprobate. The exclusive nature of God's choice is likely to trouble many. It seems very unfair. Why Abraham? Why not the Canaanites? And there are no easy answer to those questions. But neither are they the end of the story. If we want to understand what's going on, we've got to dig deeper into God's choice of Abraham's family. A second observation sets God's election of Abraham and his family in a different light by pointing to God's purposes in choosing them. Here's the key detail. God may have chosen Abraham's family instead of any other nation, but he also chose Abraham's family for the sake of the other nations. Did you catch that? God passed over other families of the earth. He picked Abraham and his descendants, but we must not fail to see that God specifically said to Abraham that he was chosen in order that all the families of the earth should be blessed. That's Genesis 12:3. God's sovereign choice of Abraham was not an end in itself. Instead, it was the providential means to the end of bringing the blessing of God's salvation to those who were initially passed over. Abraham was the prototypical object of God's electing love. But his election always carried the goal of bringing that same love to all the families of the earth. To put it in theological language, the kind of language that often characterizes the debate over divine election, Abraham's family was chosen by God in order to bless the reprobate nations. The elect are chosen for the sake of those who were not elected. And they are elect in order that the reprobate might enjoy and benefit from the blessings of God's saving work. Now, this throws a wrench in the Calvinist view that election is unconditional. Take, for example, the language of the Westminster Confession of Faith. It says that the number of the elect is so certain and definite that it cannot be either increased or diminished. From this point of view, there's a firm and fixed line drawn between those God has chosen and those he has passed over. The numbers of each group are unchangeable. Only the elect will be saved, and the reprobate will necessarily be consigned to eternal torment, never knowing the joy of God's blessing. The elect, on the one hand, and the reprobate on the other, are related only through contrast. One is saved, the other is lost. Given our interpretation of Genesis 12, it looks like the language of Westminster takes the doctrine of election in a very different direction from the way the Bible frames the doctrine of election, which is grounded in the calling of Abraham and the promises to Abraham. For Abraham and in his family, the elect, are related to the reprobate not merely in terms of contrast, but also in terms of instrumentality. They are God's instrument, the means by which the reprobate are blessed. If it's true, as we've seen, that God chose Abraham's family for the purpose of blessing the unchosen nations, then we should resist framing election in unconditional terms. So if we start with the instrumental character of election in the Old Testament, it sheds fresh light on the topic of election in the New Testament. Think of Romans 9 through 11, a central passage in the debate over unconditional election. Notice throughout that Paul's understanding of election is marked by extensive Old Testament allusions and quotations, which suggests that his understanding of the doctrine of election stands in continuity with what we've already seen in the Old Testament, especially in Genesis. The whole of Romans 9 through 11 is about how God is at work through Israel, Abraham's family, to bring the Messiah into the world and to bring the gospel to the nations. Paul is concerned to show how God's purposes in his choice of Israel, his election of Israel, Paul makes this point with his statement, "Those who were not my people, I will call my people. Her who was not beloved, I will call beloved." In other words, God will incorporate the reprobate nations into his sovereignly elected people. Paul also draws attention to the instrumental role of Israel in bringing the gospel to the Gentile nations by explaining how that involves Israel's surprising rejection of the Messiah, with the result that the message begins to extend beyond her national borders. This is in Romans 11. Not only that, Paul further claims that God will use the salvation of the nations instrumentally to nurture a desire among Israel to be reincorporated into the people of God, along with the nations. Do you see Paul's thought flow? The nations that Paul is describing are the very families of the earth that were passed over in God's choice of Abraham's family. Now, through the ministry of Paul, the Jew, the blessing of salvation is coming to the reprobate nations. They are being incorporated into the number of the elect. And in an unexpected but not unthinkable turn of events, God will use the election of the reprobate nations as the means to the end of the re-election of Israel. The nations have become participants in the mission to return the blessing of God's salvation to the people of Israel who had been cut off due to their rejection of the Messiah. In the end, Paul's doctrine of election means that Jews and Gentiles all stand together on equal footing as members of Abraham's family by grace through faith in Jesus. So we've seen that election in the Bible is not simply about being the object of God's blessing. It's also about becoming the instrument by which that blessing is extended to the nations. We should note that this framing of the doctrine is complementary, really supports the Wesleyan Arminian perspective that election to salvation is conditional because the reprobate nations are incorporated into the elect people of God by grace on the condition of faith in Jesus. More importantly, we must not fail to see that election is at heart a missional doctrine. It is the doctrine that says God has chosen us for a purpose, and that purpose is to take the gospel of Jesus Christ to those who have not yet experienced the joy of God's salvation. The people of God are chosen for the explicit purpose of being the instrument by which God will bless all the nations of the earth. And as the unbelieving nations come to faith in Jesus Christ, and the reprobate are incorporated into the elect people of God, they too become missional instruments for the advance of the gospel. So taken in biblical perspective, the doctrine of election should always motivate us to mission. Mission is the end of election, because God has chosen us to be the agents of his blessing, to fill the earth with the knowledge of his glory.